Frank Dorman had given everything for his country, only to discover his country had taken something he never knew was gone. For 50 years, the Vietnam veteran lived with more than just memories buried beneath his skin. When strange bumps appeared on his neck, Frank figured it was just another part of getting old. Dr. Sarah Chen thought it would be a routine visit at the small VA clinic. She'd seen it all before. But when one of the bumps burst during examination, what came out wasn't blood or pus. It was something that made a seasoned doctor break down and cry. Within hours, the clinic was locked down. Frank vanished into quarantine. The staff was sworn to silence. But secrets this big don't stay buried forever. What had the government put inside their own soldiers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Dorman's kitchen table as he settled into his daily ritual with a steaming cup of black coffee and the Millfield Gazette. At 67, Frank had learned to appreciate the small comforts that anchored his days: the familiar creak of his wooden chair, the weight of the ceramic mug his late wife, Helen, had bought at a church bazaar 30 years ago, and the predictable rhythm of small-town news that never seemed to change much from one decade to the next. He turned first to the obituaries, a habit that had developed over the past few years as more names began looking familiar. Today, Harold Kemper, 73, peacefully at home surrounded by family. Frank remembered Harold from the hardware store, always ready with advice about fixing a leaky faucet or choosing the right grade of sandpaper. Another good man gone. Frank touched the strange bumps on his neck absently as he read. They'd been growing larger recently, harder to ignore. The kitchen still held traces of Helen's presence everywhere. Her collection of ceramic roosters lined the windowsill, catching the morning light. Her handwriting remained on recipe cards tucked behind the sugar bowl. Even 5 years after her death, Frank sometimes caught himself setting out 2 coffee cups, muscle memory stronger than grief. He'd loved her for 42 years, married her when he came back from Vietnam in 1971. A damaged young man trying to build a normal life on a foundation that felt perpetually unsteady. Those early years had been the hardest. The nightmares, the sudden sweats, the way loud noises could send him diving for cover behind their couch. Helen had been patient, more patient than he deserved. She'd hold him when he woke up screaming, never asking questions about what he'd seen or done in those steamy jungles half a world away. Frank had tried to tell her once, early in their marriage, about the things that happened after the fighting stopped, the medical examinations. The shots, they said, were for malaria prevention, the way some of the guys started acting strange afterward. But the words wouldn't come, and eventually, he'd stopped trying. The Vietnam War had been different for Frank's unit than for most soldiers. They'd been stationed near Saigon during the final months, supposedly helping with the evacuation efforts. But there had been other duties, classified things they weren't supposed to talk about even decades later. Frank remembered the medical facility where they'd been taken for what the officers called preventive health measures. Clean white walls, doctors with kind voices and cold hands, needles that hurt more than they should have. Some of the guys complained afterward about feeling different, about things not being right in their heads or their bodies. Frank had felt it to a subtle wrongness, like something foreign had taken up residence inside him. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the Millfield via a clinic that Tuesday morning, carrying her own invisible burdens. At 45, she moved with the efficient precision of someone who had once commanded operating rooms at Chicago General, where she'd been known for her steady hands and unflappable demeanor during the most chaotic trauma cases. Those days felt like another lifetime now, before the mistake that had cost a young father his life and sent her fleeing to this quiet corner of Iowa, where the medical emergencies were usually no more serious than diabetes monitoring and blood pressure. Checks. The move to Millfield had been both exile and salvation. After 18 years of high-stakes surgery, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death, the gentle pace of rural family medicine should have been a relief. Instead, Sarah often felt like she was sleepwalking through her days, going through the motions of caring for patients whose problems seemed almost trivial compared to the life-or-death drama she'd once navigated. But perhaps that was what she needed, a place where her failures wouldn't echo quite so loudly, where she could remember what it felt like to help people without the constant fear of catastrophic error. The VA clinic itself was a testament to bureaucratic indifference, fluorescent lights that flickered, linoleum floors worn thin by decades of veterans' footsteps, and waiting room chairs that had seen better decades. The staff did their best with limited resources. Betty Morrison, the head nurse, had been there for 28 years and knew every veteran in 3 counties by name. Dr. Miguel Martinez was fresh out of residency, full of enthusiasm and idealism that reminded Sarah of her younger self. Together, they served a population of aging warriors who had given their youth to their country and now faced their declining years with a mixture of stoic pride and quiet desperation. Frank's daughter, Rebecca, had inherited her mother's patience and her father's stubborn streak, though she'd channeled both traits into a career that would have made Helen proud and Frank worried. At 38, Rebecca Dorman was one of Chicago Tribune's most respected investigative journalists, known for her relentless pursuit of corporate corruption and governmental malfeasance. Her latest series on pharmaceutical companies hiding adverse drug reactions had earned her national recognition and several death threats, both of which she wore like badges of honor. But success in Chicago couldn't bridge the gulf that had opened between her and her father after Helen's funeral. Frank had retreated into himself, refusing help, dismissing Rebecca's concerns about his health and living situation. Their last real conversation had been an argument, Rebecca pleading with him to move closer to Chicago, where she could look after him, Frank stubbornly insisting he could take care of himself just fine. The pride that had helped him survive combat and build a life was now keeping him isolated from the daughter, who loved him but didn't know how to reach him. Rebecca understood Frank's war had marked him in ways that went deeper than the visible scars on his hands and arms. She'd grown up knowing not to ask about certain things, why he sometimes stared off into space during family dinners, why he couldn't watch war movies, why he kept a loaded pistol in his nightstand, even though Millfield was one of the safest towns in Iowa. Helen had been the bridge between Frank's damaged past and his family's present, translating his silences and smoothing over his rough edges. Without her, father and daughter had drifted apart like boats cut from their moorings. The bumps on Frank's neck had first appeared 6 months earlier, small and hardly noticeable. He dismissed them as age spots or maybe insect bites that had gotten infected. But they'd grown steadily, becoming hard lumps beneath his skin that sometimes ached and occasionally seemed to move on their own. Frank had avoided doctors most of his life, distrusting medical professionals ever since those mysterious examinations in Vietnam. But as the bumps multiplied and grew more uncomfortable, even his stubborn independence began to wear thin. The VA clinic represented a compromise, not quite admitting he needed help, but acknowledging that maybe these things on his neck warranted a quick look. Frank told himself it would be a 5-minute appointment, probably just some antibiotics or maybe a prescription cream. Nothing serious. Nothing that would require him to admit that his body was betraying him in ways that felt disturbingly familiar, like echoes of something that had happened long ago in a place he tried very hard to forget. Betty Morrison had scheduled Frank's appointment for early afternoon, knowing he preferred to avoid the morning rush when the clinic was usually crowded, with other veterans picking up medications or attending group sessions. Frank appreciated the consideration. Betty had known him since Helen's death, had been one of the church ladies who'd brought casseroles and kind words. During those dark weeks when grief felt like drowning in slow motion. Dr. Chen reviewed Frank's file before his arrival, noting the sparse medical history typical of men his generation who had learned to endure pain in silence. A few visits over the years for minor injuries, annual checkups that Helen had insisted upon, nothing to suggest serious health problems. The complaint about neck growths seemed routine enough, probably sebaceous cysts or lipomas, easily treated. Sarah expected to schedule a minor surgical procedure, write a prescription, and move on to the next patient. But as Frank settled into the examination room that Tuesday afternoon, neither he nor Dr. Chen could have imagined that their lives were about to intersect with forces that had been set in motion 50 years earlier, in a military medical facility outside Saigon, where young soldiers had been told they were receiving preventive care, never suspecting they were actually participants in an experiment that would claim their lives decades later. The Purple Heart Medal in Frank's dresser drawer at home, awarded for wounds received in service to his country, would soon take on a bitter irony as he discovered that his greatest injury had been inflicted not by enemy fire, but by the very government he had sworn to defend. Frank arrived at the VA clinic 15 minutes early, as was his habit for any appointment that mattered. The waiting room held its usual collection of veterans, men and women whose bodies told stories of service in conflicts spanning 6 decades. He recognized most of them. Jerry Patterson reading a hunting magazine, despite having lost most of his vision to Agent Orange exposure. Maria Santos knitting what looked like another blanket for her grandchildren while waiting for her physical therapy appointment. And old Pete Kowalski sleeping in his wheelchair, a Purple Heart pin barely visible on his faded denim jacket. Betty Morrison greeted Frank with the warm smile that had comforted thousands of veterans over the years. "Right on time, Frank. Dr. Chen will be with you shortly. How are those roses Helen planted doing?" "Coming along fine," Frank replied, though he hadn't tended to Helen's garden properly in months. The roses bloomed and faded according to their own schedule now, wild and untended like so much of his life since she'd been gone. The examination room smelled of disinfectant and wore the sterile efficiency of medical facilities everywhere. Frank settled onto the paper-covered table, the crinkling sound oddly amplifying in the small space. Through the thin walls, he could hear Dr. Martinez discussing medication adjustments with another patient, the murmur of voices a familiar soundtrack of aging warriors managing the long retreat from health. Dr. Sarah Chen entered with Frank's file, her professional demeanor masking the exhaustion that had become her constant companion since arriving in Millfield. She'd learned to project confidence even when she felt anything but certain, a skill developed during her residency and refined through years of trauma surgery where patients, families looked to her for reassurance she couldn't always provide. "Mr. Dorman, I'm Dr. Chen. I understand you're concerned about some growths on your neck." Frank nodded, suddenly self-conscious about the bumps that had become impossible to ignore. "They've been there about 6 months now. Getting bigger, sometimes. They ache. Wife always said I should see a doctor about things like this, but..." He trailed off, the familiar pang of loss cutting short his explanation. Sarah's examination began routinely enough. She palpated the lymph nodes under Frank's jaw, checked his throat, and felt for any obvious abnormalities. But when her fingers encountered the growths Frank had described, she paused. They weren't like anything she'd felt before, harder than typical cysts, with an unusual warmth and a texture that seemed almost granular. "These are interesting," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "How long did you say they've been present?" 6 months, maybe a little more. They don't hurt much, just different. Sarah positioned her examination light and leaned in for a closer look. The growths were arranged in an odd pattern along Frank's neck, 5 distinct bumps of varying sizes. The largest, just below his left ear, was about the size of a marble and had a slightly bluish tint beneath the skin. As she pressed gently to assess its mobility, Frank winced. "Sorry, I know it's tender. I'm just trying to determine what we're dealing with." Frank's mind drifted as she worked, the clinical touching triggering memories he'd spent decades trying to suppress. Other doctors, other examination rooms, the smell of antiseptic mixing with fear. Vietnam, 1971. The medical facility outside Saigon, where they'd been taken for what the officers called routine health maintenance. The doctors there had been American military physicians who spoke softly and smiled reassuringly while they drew blood, administered injections, and asked questions about how the soldiers were feeling, thinking, coping with the stress of combat and deployment. "Mr. Dorman?" Dr. Chen's voice brought him back to the present. "I'm going to apply a little more pressure to get a better sense of the structure. Let me know if it becomes too uncomfortable." Frank nodded, gripping the edge of the examination table. Sarah positioned her thumbs on either side of the largest growth and pressed firmly, trying to determine if it was fluid-filled or solid, whether it might be attached to underlying structures. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the bump burst, not like a typical cyst rupturing, with the expected discharge of infected material. Instead, something else entirely emerged, a substance that seemed to shift and move with its own purpose. It was iridescent, catching the examination room light in ways that made Frank's eyes water. The material had the consistency of thick oil but moved like it was alive, spreading across Frank's neck in patterns that defied gravity. Sarah jerked her hands back as if she'd been burned. In 18 years of practicing medicine, she'd seen infections, tumors, cysts, and every manner of biological abnormality. But this was something else entirely. The substance seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and as she watched in horror, it began to emit a faint phosphorescent glow. What is that?" Frank's voice was tight with fear, his hand reaching toward his neck but stopping short of touching the spreading material. Sarah's medical training warred with her instinct to flee. The substance was clearly not organic in any conventional sense, but it was emerging from inside Frank's body. As they both watched, paralyzed by the impossibility of what they were seeing, the material began to form geometric patterns on Frank's skin, like circuitry or some kind of biological technology. "Mr. Dorman, I need you to stay very still," Sarah managed, her voice barely controlled. She reached for the emergency call button with a shaking hand, but before she could press it, the substance suddenly contracted back into itself and disappeared, leaving only a small puncture wound where the bump had been. Frank's neck looked almost normal again, except for 4 other bumps that remained intact and a thin line of conventional blood where the eruption had occurred. But the smell lingered, something metallic and wrong, like ozone after lightning strikes, mixed with the scent of hot electronics. Sarah stared at Frank, then at her own hands, trying to process what she'd just witnessed. Her medical training offered no explanation for what they'd seen. The substance had clearly been artificial, but it had been inside Frank's body, integrated with his tissue as if it belonged there. "Doctor?" Frank's voice was small, frightened in a way that reminded Sarah that beneath his veteran stoicism was a man who'd already seen more than his share of inexplicable horrors. Before Sarah could respond, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The careful composure she'd maintained since her Chicago disgrace cracked apart like ice under pressure. All the emotions she'd suppressed, grief, guilt, fear, inadequacy, came flooding back, amplified by the impossibility of what she'd just witnessed. She sank into the chair beside Frank's examination table and put her head in her hands. Professional boundaries dissolving as tears she'd held back for months finally came. Frank, despite his own terror, reached out and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, the instinctive gesture of a soldier comforting a fellow casualty. "It's going to be okay," he said softly, though neither of them believed it. Outside the examination room, Betty Morrison noticed that Dr. Chen's appointment was running long. She knocked gently on the door, but received no response. When she opened it to check, she found Frank and Dr. Chen sitting in stunned silence, both pale and shaken, the air in the room carrying a strange metallic odor that made her think of electrical fires. Within an hour, the clinic would be swarming with federal agents. Within 2 hours, Frank would disappear into a quarantine facility, his location unknown even to the staff who had treated him. And within 3 hours, every person who had been in the clinic that day would sign documents swearing them to silence about events they were told they had imagined. But secrets this profound don't stay buried forever, especially when they're witnessed by people who understand that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Rebecca Dorman was in the middle of editing her latest expose on pharmaceutical price fixing when her phone rang at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something about the timing during normal business hours when most people were working made her answer. "Miss Dorman? This is Betty Morrison at the Millfield Via Clinic. I'm calling about your father." The words hit Rebecca like ice water. She and Frank hadn't spoken in 3 months, not since their argument about his refusal to consider moving to assisted living. Rebecca had been the one to storm out. Frustrated by his stubborn independence and tired of fighting battles he was determined to lose. What happened? Rebecca's fingers were already pulling up airline websites on her computer. "He's had a medical emergency. I can't discuss details over the phone, but you should come as soon as possible." The careful neutrality in Betty's voice told Rebecca more than the words themselves. In her years as an investigative journalist, she'd learned to read between the lines of official statements. This wasn't just a heart attack or stroke. This was something complicated, something that required careful language and probably involved lawyers. The drive from Chicago to Millfield normally took 4 hours, but Rebecca made it in 3.5, her mind racing through possibilities while her car ate up miles of Iowa interstate. She'd covered enough medical stories to know that "can't discuss details" usually meant either privacy issues or something more sinister. Given Frank's history with the VA system, Rebecca's journalist instincts were already suggesting uncomfortable possibilities. Memories of her father crowded her thoughts as cornfields flashed past her windows. Frank Dorman had always been a complicated, man-loving but distant, protective but secretive. Rebecca remembered childhood evenings when Frank would sit on their front porch, smoking cigarettes and staring at nothing she could see. Helen would join him sometimes, her presence seeming to pull him back from whatever dark place his mind had traveled to growing up. Rebecca had accepted her father's silences and sudden departures from family gatherings as normal. It wasn't until college, when she'd studied the psychological effects of combat trauma, that she'd begun to understand the weight Frank carried. He'd served his country with honor, earning a Purple Heart and several commendations, but he'd never talked about what he'd done or seen in Vietnam. The war was a closed door in the Dorman household, locked and marked with invisible signs warning against entry. After Helen's death, that door had seemed to expand, swallowing more and more of Frank until Rebecca felt like she was trying to maintain a relationship with a ghost. Their arguments had grown more frequent and bitter, with Rebecca pushing him to engage with life and Frank retreating further into his solitary routines. She'd accused him of giving up, of dishonoring Helen's memory by refusing to live. He'd accused her of not understanding what it meant to lose the only person who had ever truly known you. The last thing Rebecca had said to her father was that she was tired of watching him die by degrees, that she couldn't stand by while he deliberately isolated himself from everyone who cared about him. Frank's response had been to suggest that maybe she should focus on her own life and let him manage what was left of his. Rebecca had left his house that day, convinced she was doing the right thing, giving him space to figure out what he wanted. Now, 3 months later, she wondered if her absence had simply accelerated his decline. The Millfield VA clinic looked different when Rebecca arrived, too. Many official vehicles in the parking lot. Too many people in dark suits moving with the purposeful efficiency of federal agents. Rebecca's investigative instincts immediately went on high alert. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was a containment operation. She parked across the street and watched for several minutes, noting the patterns of movement, the security perimeter, the way clinic staff were being escorted to and from the building. Rebecca had covered enough government stories to recognize the signs of a federal investigation or cover-up. Whatever had happened to Frank, it had attracted the attention of people with badges and unlimited overtime budgets. Rebecca's approach to the clinic was stopped at a security checkpoint that hadn't existed during her last visit to Millfield. A polite but firm agent in a dark suit examined her driver's license and asked her to wait while he made a phone call. "I'm here to see my father, Frank Dorman. He's a patient." "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but Mr. Dorman has been transferred to a specialized facility for treatment. For his safety and privacy, we can't provide additional information at this time." The careful phrasing confirmed Rebecca's suspicions. This was official language, designed to provide no real information, while sounding cooperative. She'd heard similar words from corporate spokespersons and government officials, trying to avoid accountability for everything from environmental disasters to financial fraud. "What kind of specialized facility? What's wrong with him?" "Ma'am, you'll need to speak with the family liaison officer. If you'd like to provide your contact information, someone will be in touch within 24 hours. Rebecca knew a brush-off when she heard one. She also knew that 24 hours in government time often meant weeks or months, if ever. But she smiled and nodded, providing her information while mentally cataloging everything she'd observed. The agent's badge identified him as Department of Health and Human Services. But Rebecca's experience told her that HHS didn't normally deploy rapid response teams for routine medical emergencies. After leaving the clinic, Rebecca drove to the Millfield Diner, a local institution where information flowed as freely as coffee. The owner, May Sullivan, had known Rebecca since she was a child visiting her grandparents. If anyone in town knew what was really happening, it would be May. "Rebecca, honey, I heard about your dad. Terrible thing. Just terrible." May's sympathy seemed genuine, but her eyes carried the wariness of someone who'd been warned to be careful with her words. "What exactly did you hear, May?" "Well, you know how these things go. Frank went in for a routine appointment, and next thing you know, there's all kinds of government folks swarming the place. They say he's sick, needs special treatment. But between you and me, it seems like an awful lot of fuss for a sick old man." Rebecca pressed gently for more details, but May had clearly been instructed or frightened into limiting her comments. The pattern was becoming clear. Whatever had happened at the clinic had triggered a major federal response, complete with information control and witness management. That evening, Rebecca checked into the Millfield Inn and began making phone calls. Her editor at the Tribune, Marcus Webb, listened to her preliminary assessment and immediately offered resources. "This smells like a story, Rebecca. Government cover-ups, mysterious medical emergencies, federal agents in small towns. It has all the elements. What do you need? Time and access. I need to find out where they've taken Frank, and I need to understand why his routine medical appointment turned into a federal case. You've got it. But be careful. If this involves national security or classified programs, they're not going to appreciate a journalist asking questions." Rebecca smiled grimly. In her experience, the more desperately officials wanted to avoid questions, the more those questions needed to be asked. Frank was her father, but he was also potentially a victim of something larger and more sinister. Rebecca had built her career on exposing the truth, especially when powerful people preferred it remain hidden. As she settled in for what she suspected would be a long investigation, Rebecca felt the familiar mix of determination and apprehension that came with taking on forces much larger than herself. But Frank was family, and family was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Rebecca's first real breakthrough came when she decided to approach Frank's situation like any other investigative story by following the paper trail. At the Millfield County Courthouse, she requested Frank's military service records, knowing they would be heavily redacted, but hoping for enough information to establish a timeline. What she received 3 days later was more concerning than helpful. A file so thoroughly blackened by redaction, marks that entire pages contained only headers and dates. Frank's basic service information was intact and listed 1969. Served in Vietnam 1,971,971. Honorable discharge with commendations, including a Purple Heart. But every detail about his specific unit, locations, and activities had been classified at levels that surprised even Rebecca, who had dealt with reluctant government agencies before. "This is unusual," confirmed Tom Bradley, Millfield sheriff and a longtime family friend who had served in Iraq during the early 2000s. Most Vietnam service records aren't this heavily classified unless the soldier was involved in special operations or intelligence work. Frank never mentioned anything like that to me. Sheriff Bradley had known Frank for 15 years, ever since Helen had dragged her reluctant husband to a community barbecue where the two veterans had found common ground in their shared understanding of service and sacrifice. Tom had always respected Frank's privacy about his war experiences, but he'd noticed things, the way Frank would position himself in restaurants to watch the exits, his startled reactions to unexpected loud noises, the careful way he spoke about his time in Southeast Asia. "There's something else," Tom continued, lowering his voice even though they were alone in his office. "I've been getting pressure from federal authorities to limit my department's involvement in Frank's case. They've made it clear that this is outside local jurisdiction, but they haven't explained why a medical emergency requires that level of federal oversight." Rebecca felt the familiar tingle that came with sensing a story much larger than its initial appearance. Government overreach in medical situations usually meant one of several possibilities: infectious disease containment, national security implications, or cover-up of institutional liability. Given Frank's military background and the extensive redaction of his service records, Rebecca suspected they were dealing with the latter. Her next step was tracking down other members of Frank's military unit, a process that proved both frustrating and illuminating. The unit designation itself was classified, but Rebecca's research skills had been honed by years of investigating corporate malfeasance and political corruption. She knew how to find information that powerful people preferred to keep hidden, using Frank's service dates and known locations. Rebecca identified several veterans who had served in Vietnam during the same period. Most were deceased, their obituaries revealing the typical pattern of Vietnam veteran mortality: cancer, heart disease, and suicide at rates significantly higher than their civilian peers. But 3 names stood out. Thomas Chen, no relation to Dr. Sarah Chen; Robert Martinez; and James Tommy Washington. Tommy Chen, now 71 and living in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, agreed to meet Rebecca at a coffee shop halfway between their locations. His reluctance was obvious, but something in Rebecca's voice, the desperation of a daughter trying to understand her father's situation, seemed to overcome his caution. "I haven't talked about those days in decades," Tommy said, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. "We were all told it was classified, that we could face prosecution if we discussed certain aspects of our service. Tommy, my father is missing. The government has him in some kind of quarantine, and no one will tell me why. I think it might be connected to whatever happened to your unit in Vietnam. Tommy Chen studied Rebecca's face, seeing Frank's stubborn determination reflected in his daughter's eyes. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. We weren't just regular infantry, Rebecca. Our unit was selected for what they called enhanced medical monitoring. After regular combat operations, we'd be taken to a special medical facility near Saigon. They told us it was for preventive health care, vaccinations, blood work, psychological evaluations to help us readjust to civilian life. What kind of medical procedures? Injections, mostly. Different from the regular vaccinations we'd already received. They said they were experimental treatments to help prevent long-term health problems from Agent Orange exposure and combat. Stress. Made sense at the time. We all knew guys who were having problems adjusting. And if the military had found ways to help us avoid those issues, we were willing to try. Tommy paused, his expression darkening with memory. But some of the guys started reporting strange symptoms afterward. Headaches, vision problems, feeling like something was wrong inside their bodies. A few complained about strange dreams, like they were being watched or monitored, even when they were alone. The medical staff said those were normal adjustment reactions and would fade with time. Did they fade? For some, maybe. For others, Tommy rolled up his sleeve, revealing a series of small scars along his forearm. About 10 years ago, I started developing these growths. Doctors here couldn't explain them, kept saying they were benign cysts. But they felt different, like they had their own blood supply or something. Rebecca leaned forward, her journalistic instincts fully engaged. Tommy, how many men from your unit are still alive? As far as I know, just me and Frank. Bobby Martinez died of brain cancer 3 years ago, right around his 65th birthday. Jimmy Washington had a heart attack 2 years ago, also 65. Seems like everyone from our unit who makes it to retirement age developed some kind of health crisis right around the same time. The pattern was becoming clear to Rebecca, too clear to be coincidental. Frank's unit had been subjects in some kind of medical experiment, and now, as they reached their late 60s, whatever had been done to them was beginning to manifest in fatal ways. Tommy, I need you to help me find out what really happened to you and Frank in Vietnam. I think my father's life depends on it. Tommy Chen looked at Rebecca for a long moment, then nodded grimly. I've been carrying this secret for 50 years. Rebecca, maybe it's time someone with the skills to fight back knew the truth. Meanwhile, in an undisclosed medical facility 300 miles away, Frank Dorman lay in a hospital bed surrounded by monitoring equipment that would have been unrecognizable to most civilian medical professionals. His body was changing, responding to systems that had been dormant for decades, but were now awakening with purposes their original designers had never intended. Dr. Sarah Chen's medical curiosity had always been both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. 3 days after Frank Dorman's mysterious quarantine, she found herself unable to concentrate on routine patient care, her mind constantly returning to the impossible substance that had emerged from his neck. Against every protocol and federal warning she'd received, Sarah had managed to collect a small sample of the material before the agents arrived. The sample was smaller than a pinhead, barely visible on the microscope slide she'd hidden in her personal medical kit. But under magnification, it revealed structures that challenged everything Sarah understood about biology. The material appeared to be part organic tissue and part manufactured technology, with what looked like microscopic circuitry integrated into cellular structures in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Working late in the clinic's small laboratory, Sarah ran every test her limited equipment could perform. The sample conducted electricity, responded to magnetic fields, and exhibited growth patterns when exposed to specific wavelengths of light. Most disturbing, it seemed to react to her presence, organizing itself into more complex patterns when she leaned closer to the microscope. Meanwhile, Rebecca's investigation had led her to the archives of the Iowa State Historical Society, where she discovered references to a classified military medical program called Project Lazarus. The program had supposedly been designed to develop treatments for combat injuries that could regenerate damaged tissue and restore full function to wounded soldiers. But the few unredacted documents Rebecca could access suggested the project's actual goals had been far more ambitious and more sinister. Project Lazarus wasn't about healing, Rebecca explained to Tommy Chen during their second meeting, this time at his modest apartment in Cedar Rapids. The research objectives I found mention long-term behavioral modification and post-service monitoring capabilities. They weren't trying to help veterans recover from war. They were trying to control them afterward. Tommy's face had gone pale as he listened to Rebecca's findings. His own research into his mysterious health problems had led him to similar conclusions, though he'd lacked Rebecca's investigative skills to connect the broader patterns. "Makes sense now," Tommy said quietly. "After we got back, some of the guys from our unit started having problems with authority figures, questioning orders, speaking out against the war. Most of them ended up in psychiatric facilities or prison within a few years." Rebecca pulled out a notebook filled with her research. "I've been tracking the life histories of everyone from Frank's unit I can identify. The pattern is consistent. Those who became politically active or spoke out against military policies died young from sudden illnesses. Those who stayed quiet lived longer, but they're all dying now as they reach retirement age. Like the government was cleaning house," Tommy said grimly. "Exactly. But Frank's case is different. Instead of dying quietly, he's had a public medical event that's drawn attention. Whatever was supposed to happen to him has malfunctioned somehow." Dr. Sarah Chen's unauthorized research had reached a similar conclusion through a different path. The sample she'd analyzed showed signs of being designed to integrate with human neural tissue over extended periods. The microscopic circuitry appeared to be some kind of monitoring and control system, sophisticated beyond anything she'd seen in current medical literature. More disturbing, the sample had continued to evolve while in her possession. Over the course of 3 days, it had grown from a simple cluster of cells to a complex structure that seemed to respond to electromagnetic signals. Sarah realized she was looking at biotechnology that was decades ahead of anything publicly acknowledged. Her breakthrough came when she discovered that the sample reacted strongly to specific radio frequencies. Using equipment borrowed from the clinic's physical therapy department, Sarah found that certain wavelengths caused the material to contract and become dormant, while others stimulated rapid growth and activity. The implications were terrifying. If similar materials were inside Frank and other veterans, someone with the right equipment could potentially monitor their location, influence their behavior, or even trigger medical emergencies from a distance. Frank wasn't just sick. He was being remotely controlled by technology that had been implanted in his body 50 years earlier. Sarah's discovery coincided with Rebecca's interview of a former military nurse named Patricia Hendricks, now 83, and living in a nursing home outside Des Moines. Patricia had worked at the medical facility in Vietnam, where Frank's unit had received their mysterious treatments, and her memories of those days had haunted her for decades. They brought in groups of soldiers for what they called preventive medicine. Patricia recalled, her voice barely above a whisper. But the procedures weren't in any medical textbook I'd ever studied. We were injecting them with substances. They came in unmarked vials, following protocols that changed weekly based on instructions from doctors we never met. "What kind of substances?" Rebecca asked gently. "I don't know. They never told us. But the soldiers would sometimes have reactions that didn't make medical sense. Not allergic reactions or infections, but behavioral changes. Some became more compliant, others more agitated. A few started claiming they could hear voices or feel things moving under their skin. Patricia's hand shook as she continued. The worst part was the follow-up protocols. We were instructed to maintain detailed records on every soldier who received the treatments, including psychological profiles, family information, and post-service contact details. It was like they were building files for long-term surveillance. Though, any of those records still exist? Rebecca asked. One kept copies, Patricia admitted. I knew what we were doing was wrong, even if I didn't understand why. When the program ended, I took files on about 30 soldiers, thinking someday someone might need proof of what happened to them. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. Do you still have them? Patricia nodded toward a locked filing cabinet in the corner of her small room. I'd been waiting 50 years for someone to ask the right questions. The files Patricia had preserved contained detailed medical records, psychological evaluations, and most importantly, a complete list of the substances that had been injected into Frank and his fellow soldiers. The experimental cocktail included not just drugs and biologics, but what the documents referred to as synthetic neural interface materials, microscopic devices designed to integrate with the soldiers' nervous systems. As Rebecca photographed the documents with her phone, she realized she was looking at evidence of one of the most extensive human experimentation programs in American history. Hundreds of soldiers had been unknowingly converted into test subjects for technology that wouldn't be publicly acknowledged for decades. But the files also revealed something else. The experiments had been designed with built-in termination protocols. The synthetic materials were programmed to activate after approximately 50 years, causing the subjects to develop fatal medical conditions that would appear to be natural aging processes. Frank wasn't just sick, he was being systematically eliminated, along with every other survivor who might someday talk about what had been done to them. The government had turned its own veterans into walking time bombs, and now those bombs were going off right on schedule. Rebecca's investigation took on new urgency as she realized the scope of what she'd uncovered. Project Lazarus wasn't just a historical atrocity. It was an ongoing operation with deadly consequences playing out in real time. Armed with Patricia, Hendricks' files, and Dr. Sarah Chen's analysis, Rebecca began connecting dots that painted a picture of systematic murder disguised as natural causes. The breakthrough came when Rebecca cross-referenced the names in Patricia's files with obituary records from the past 5 years. The pattern was undeniable. Veterans from the experimental program were dying at precisely the age when the synthetic materials in their bodies were programmed to activate. But Frank's case had deviated from the plan somehow, creating a public medical incident instead of a quiet death. Dr. Sarah Chen had reached similar conclusions through her continued analysis of the sample. Working with borrowed equipment from the regional hospital, she discovered that the biotechnology was designed to respond to specific activation signals, electromagnetic pulses transmitted on frequencies that could be sent from considerable distances. It's like a remote control for the human body, Sarah explained to Rebecca during a clandestine meeting at a truck stop outside Millfield. The materials integrate with neural pathways over decades, becoming part of the subject's nervous system. When activated, they can cause everything from heart attacks to brain aneurysms, depending on where they've established themselves. But Frank's malfunctioned somehow. Not malfunctioned, evolved. The sample I analyzed has been adapting and changing over the 50 years it's been in his body. Instead of simply causing organ failure as designed, it's developed its own biological imperatives. It's trying to replicate itself, spread to other tissues, maybe even transmit information. The implications were staggering. Frank wasn't just a victim of government experimentation. He was potentially a walking biological weapon whose body contained technology that had grown beyond its original parameters. Meanwhile, Rebecca's research had led her to Dr. Edmund Kessler, the 85-year-old former military scientist who had overseen Project Lazarus during the early 1970s. Kessler lived in a heavily secured retirement community outside Washington, D.C. His location supposedly secret, but discoverable through careful investigation of academic and medical records. Getting access to Kessler required all of Rebecca's journalistic skills and several carefully crafted lies to retirement home staff. When she finally sat across from the elderly scientist in his comfortable but prison-like apartment, she found a man whose guilt had been eating at him for decades. "I've been expecting someone like you for 30 years, Kessler said without preamble. "Every time one of those boys dies, I wonder if this will be the case that exposes what we did." "What exactly did you do, Dr. Kessler?" Kessler's hand shook as he poured tea from an expensive china set, the delicate ritual seeming to anchor him as he prepared to confess crimes he'd carried for half a century. "We were tasked with solving what the military saw as a growing problem. Veterans returning from Vietnam with anti-war sentiments, psychological trauma, and tendencies toward political activism. The protests, the war crimes allegations, the growing peace movement, all of it was seen as a threat to national security. So you turned them into test subjects." "We told ourselves we were helping them. The synthetic neural interfaces were designed to monitor stress levels, detect psychological instability, and provide remote therapeutic intervention when necessary. But the real purpose was social control, the ability to track, monitor, and influence the behavior of potentially problematic veterans." Rebecca felt sick as she listened to Kessler's matter-of-fact description of treating human beings like laboratory animals. "The termination protocols weren't part of the original design," Kessler continued. "That was added later when the program was being shut down. Someone decided that having hundreds of veterans walking around with classified technology in their bodies posed an unacceptable security risk. So you programmed them to die?" "I programmed them to develop medical conditions that would appear natural and untraceable. The synthetic materials were designed to cause organ failure after approximately 50 years, giving the subjects normal life expectancy while eliminating any future security risks." Kessler's confession continued for 2 hours, detailing the scope of the program, the number of subjects involved, and the government agencies that had overseen the operation. Rebecca recorded every word, knowing she was documenting one of the most significant government conspiracy stories in American history. But Kessler also revealed something that changed everything. Rebecca thought she knew about Frank's situation. "Your father's case is unique," Kessler explained. "Most subjects receive standard implantation procedures, but a small group, maybe 20 soldiers, were given experimental materials that were designed to adapt and evolve within the host body. We called them Generation 2 subjects." "What was different about the Generation 2 materials?" "They were designed to develop their own intelligence over time, potentially serving as biological computers that could interface with external systems. The goal was to create veterans who could be activated decades later as intelligence assets, their synthetic neural systems providing remote access to their memories, skills, and knowledge." Rebecca felt a chill of understanding. Frank wasn't just dying from his experimental implants. He was potentially being accessed remotely, his mind and memories available to whoever had the proper equipment and codes. "Dr. Kessler, is there a way to stop the process? To save the remaining subjects?" Kessler looked at Rebecca with eyes that held 50 years of regret. "There might be. The activation signals that trigger the termination sequence can theoretically be blocked or reversed, but it would require access to the original programming codes and specialized medical equipment. The question is whether anyone in the government wants these men to survive." As Rebecca left Dr. Kessler's retirement community that evening, she understood the full magnitude of what she was up against. Frank wasn't just her father, he was living evidence of crimes that reached to the highest levels of government. Forces that had spent 50 years covering up Project Lazarus would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose the truth. But Rebecca also knew she'd found the key to saving Frank's life: the original programming codes that Dr. Kessler had helped create. Now, she just had to figure out how to use them before the people who wanted Frank dead realized how much she knew about their decades-old conspiracy. Rebecca returned to Millfield with Dr. Kessler's programming codes burned onto 3 separate encrypted drives, each hidden in a different location. She'd learned enough about government cover-ups to know that critical evidence had a way of disappearing at convenient moments. The what she discovered upon her return would shatter every assumption she'd made about Project Lazarus and her father's role in the conspiracy. Sheriff Tom Bradley met her at the county line, his patrol car's emergency lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. His face carried the grim expression of a man delivering news that would change everything. "Rebecca, we need to talk before you go any further. There are things about your father's situation that you don't understand." They drove to an abandoned farmhouse 20 miles outside town, a location Tom had used for sensitive conversations during his years in military intelligence. Rebecca's journalist instincts immediately went on high alert. Tom had never mentioned intelligence work before. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," Tom began, his confession heavy with years of deception. "I didn't meet your father at a church barbecue. I was assigned to monitor him, part of a program to keep track of Project Lazarus survivors." Rebecca felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The one person she'd trusted completely had been lying to her from the beginning. "You're working for them? The people who did this to Frank?" "It's more complicated than that. 20 years ago, I was recruited by a group within the intelligence community that was trying to protect Lazarus survivors from termination protocols. We knew the killing would start when subjects reached their late 60s, and we've been working to identify and help the remaining veterans." Tom pulled out a thick folder filled with photographs, documents, and surveillance reports. "Your father wasn't just a random victim, Rebecca. He was the most important subject in the entire program. The Generation 2 materials in his body weren't just designed to monitor and control. They were programmed to serve as a master key that could access and control all other Lazarus subjects." Rebecca stared at the documents, her mind struggling to process the implications. Frank is essentially a biological command center. Whoever controls him can potentially access the neural systems of every surviving Lazarus veteran. That's why his case has generated such intense federal attention, and why certain people are desperate to either capture or kill him. The revelation explains so much: Frank's isolation after Vietnam, his psychological struggles, his increasing paranoia. In recent years, he'd been carrying not just his own synthetic neural interfaces, but the master control system for an entire network of unwilling subjects. "How many others are there?" Rebecca asked. "We've identified 43 survivors out of the original 300 subjects. Most don't know what was done to them, and we've tried to keep it that way. But as they reach activation age, the termination protocols are starting to trigger." Tom opened a laptop and showed Rebecca a map with red dots scattered across the United States. "These are the locations of unexplained deaths in the past 2 years. All Lazarus survivors, all dying right on schedule. But something's changed in the past month. Instead of simple organ failure, some subjects have been developing symptoms similar to your father's: visible growths, behavioral changes, apparent malfunctions in their synthetic systems." Rebecca studied the pattern, her investigative instincts recognizing something significant. "They're not malfunctioning randomly. There's a geographic pattern here. All the cases with visible symptoms are within a 300-mile radius of wherever Frank is being held." "Exactly. We think Frank's master control system has begun transmitting potentially awakening dormant capabilities in other subjects. The government is terrified that the entire network might become active simultaneously. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than Rebecca had imagined. Project Lazarus hadn't just experimented on individual soldiers. It had created a network of human, biological computers that could potentially be activated as a coordinated system. But Tom's next revelation was even more shocking. "Rebecca, there's something else you need to know about your mother's death." Helen Dorman had died 5 years earlier from what doctors called a rare brain aneurysm, sudden and unexpected. Rebecca had always accepted the medical explanation, tragic but not suspicious. Helen wasn't just Frank's wife, she was his handler. Rebecca felt like she'd been physically struck. "What are you talking about?" "Helen was recruited by the same group that recruited me. Her job was to monitor Frank, keep him stable, prevent his synthetic systems from activating prematurely. She was trained in psychological techniques to manage subjects with neural implants." Tom showed Rebecca photographs of Helen at various training facilities, documents bearing her signature, and reports she'd filed about Frank's condition over the years of their marriage. Helen loved Frank genuinely. That wasn't an act. But her original assignment was to keep him under control. She was incredibly effective at it, which is why Frank remained stable for so long. Then why did she die? Because 5 years ago, Frank's systems started showing signs of spontaneous activation. Helen reported that he was having memory flashbacks about Vietnam, specifically about the medical procedures. She was trying to help him recover suppressed memories when her neural interface was activated. Rebecca's legs gave out, and she sank into a nearby chair. Helen was a Lazarus subject too, a later generation recruited specifically to manage first-generation subjects. She was programmed with termination protocols that could be triggered if she became a security risk. When her reports indicated that Frank was recovering memories that could expose the program, she was eliminated. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Rebecca's entire family history had been a lie, orchestrated by government programs that treated human beings like programmable machines. "Why are you telling me this now?" Because Frank's situation has reached a critical point. His master control system is fully active now, and both sides, the people who want to use him and the people who want to kill him, are preparing for a final confrontation. You're the only person with access to information that might save him and the other survivors. Tom handed Rebecca a secure phone and a set of encrypted coordinates. "Frank isn't being held in a government facility, Rebecca. He's being protected by our group, hidden from both the termination teams and the people who want to reactivate the entire Lazarus network. But our resources are limited, and time is running out." Rebecca looked at the coordinates, realizing they pointed to a location less than 50 miles from Millfield. "He's been that close this entire time?" "We moved him there after the clinic incident, hoping to keep him safe while we figured out how to neutralize his systems permanently. But the activation signals are getting stronger, and we're detecting movement from federal response teams. Whatever you're planning to do with Dr. Kessler's codes, it has to happen soon." As Rebecca absorbed the full scope of the deception that had shaped her entire life, she realized that everything she thought she knew about her family, her father's service, and even her own identity had been carefully constructed lies. But she also understood that she now held the key to exposing and potentially ending one of the most extensive government conspiracies in American history. The question was whether she could save her father and the other survivors before the people, who had orchestrated their suffering for 50 years, decided to terminate the entire program permanently. The safe house where Frank was being held turned out to be an abandoned missile silo converted into a sophisticated medical facility, hidden beneath a working farm 40 miles northeast of Millfield. Rebecca followed Tom Bradley's coordinates through a maze of gravel roads and electronic security checkpoints her mind still reeling from the revelations about her family's true history. Dr. Sarah Chen was already there when Rebecca arrived, her medical expertise having been quietly recruited by Tom's protective network. The small team of intelligence officers, medical professionals, and former military personnel who had been safeguarding Lazarus survivors operated with the efficiency of people who had been preparing for this moment for years. Rebecca, Dr. Chen said as she emerged from the underground facility, "You need to prepare yourself. Your father's condition has deteriorated significantly since you last saw him." The medical bay where Frank lay was filled with equipment. Rebecca didn't recognize devices that monitored not just vital signs but electromagnetic activity, neural pathway function, and what the technicians called synthetic interface coherence. Frank himself looked smaller than she remembered, his body connected to systems that were both keeping him alive and trying to understand what was happening to him. But when Frank's eyes opened and focused on Rebecca's face, she saw recognition and relief at the cut through all the technological complexity surrounding them. "Becky," he whispered, using the childhood nickname she hadn't heard in decades. "I've been remembering things. About Helen, about what they did to us. I'm sorry, I couldn't tell you before. I couldn't remember. And when I started to remember, I was afraid." Rebecca took her father's hand, feeling the slight tremor that indicated his synthetic systems were still active and evolving. "Dad, I know about Project Lazarus. I know what they did to you and Mom, and I think I might have found a way to help." Frank's grip tightened with surprising strength. "Helen tried to help me remember, near the end. She said there were things I needed to know, people I needed to warn. But every time I started to access those memories, I'd get terrible headaches, like something was fighting me from inside my own head." Tom Bradley joined them, his expression grim with the weight of decisions they all faced. "Frank's master control system has been transmitting for 3 days now," Tom explained. "We're tracking responses from Lazarus subjects across the country. Some are experiencing symptoms similar to Frank's. Others are showing signs of neural system activation. We think the network is trying to establish full connectivity." Rebecca pulled out the encrypted drives containing Dr. Kessler's programming codes. Kessler said these codes might be able to reverse the activation process, or at least block the termination protocols. But he also warned that using them incorrectly could kill Frank instantly. Dr. Chen had been studying the technical specifications Kessler had provided, correlating them with her own analysis of Frank's synthetic materials. "The codes are essentially a master reset function," Sarah explained. "They would theoretically return Frank's systems to their original dormant state, breaking his connection with the other subjects and neutralizing the termination protocols. But the process would be irreversible. Once we use the codes, there's no going back." Frank listened to the discussion with growing understanding of what was being asked of him. "If I let you use these codes, what happens to the other survivors? The men who are starting to show symptoms?" Tom consulted data streaming in from monitoring stations across the country. "Without your system coordinating them, they're synthetic. Interfaces would likely return to dormancy as well. The termination protocols might stop, but we can't be certain. Some might survive, others might not. And if we don't use the codes, your system continues to evolve and spread its influence. Eventually, every Lazarus subject becomes part of an active network that could be accessed and controlled by whoever has the right, equipment, and knowledge. The government has teams working on exactly that. They want to reactivate the entire program under their control." Rebecca realized they were facing an impossible choice: save Frank and risk abandoning the other survivors to their fate, or leave Frank's system active and potentially create a weapon that could be used against all of them. But Frank had already made his decision. 50 years ago, they turned us into weapons without our knowledge or consent. "I won't let them do it again," even if it means sacrificing myself to stop them. As they prepared to implement Kessler's reset codes, Rebecca coordinated with her journalism contacts to ensure the story would survive regardless of what happened to them. She transmitted copies of all evidence, Patricia Hendricks' medical files, Dr. Kessler's confession, documentation of the protective network's activities to multiple news organizations with instructions to publish if she failed to check in within 24 hours. Meanwhile, Tom's intelligence network reported increasing federal activity in the area. Satellite surveillance had detected their location, and response teams were mobilizing with equipment designed to capture rather than kill Frank and anyone associated with him. They want him alive, Tom realized. The government has decided to risk reactivating the Lazarus network rather than lose control of it entirely. If they can capture Frank and his programming codes, they could potentially control every surviving subject. Dr. Chen began preparing the medical equipment needed to implement the reset procedure, a complex process that would require precise timing and careful monitoring of Frank's vital signs. The synthetic materials had become so integrated with his nervous system that removing their influence would essentially require rebuilding his neural pathways in real time. The procedure will take approximately 4 hours, Sarah explained. During that time, Frank will be essentially unconscious while his brain reorganizes itself around the absence of synthetic influence. If anything goes wrong, if the integration has progressed too far, the shock could kill him. Frank gripped Rebecca's hand again, his eyes clear and determined despite the fear she could see beneath his resolve. "Becky, there are things your mother made me promise to tell you if something like this ever happened. About why she really married me, about what she gave up to protect our family." Rebecca felt tears she'd been holding back for days finally start to fall. "Dad, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. Helen loved you more than anything in this world, but she also loved me enough to spend 40 years of her life keeping me stable and functional. She could have had a normal life, a normal family, but she chose to dedicate herself to managing my condition because she believed I was worth saving." Frank's voice grew stronger as he continued, as if finally speaking these truths was restoring some essential part of himself. "When Helen died, it wasn't just losing my wife. It was losing the person who made it possible for me to be your father, instead of just a damaged veteran carrying government secrets. I've been afraid that without her influence, I might become something dangerous, something that could hurt you. Dad, you could never hurt me, not intentionally. But the things they put inside me, the systems they integrated with my mind, I don't always have control over them. Helen knew how to keep those systems quiet, how to help me maintain my own identity despite the foreign influences. Without her, I've been losing myself piece by piece." As alarms began sounding throughout the facility, indicating the approach of federal forces, Rebecca realized this might be her last conversation with her father as the man she'd known all her life. The reset procedure would either restore him to who he'd been before Vietnam or kill him in the attempt. "We need to start now," Dr. Chen announced, her hands already moving across the control systems. "Federal teams are less than 30 minutes out, and once they arrive, we won't have another chance." Frank looked at Rebecca one last time, his eyes holding all the love and regret and hope that had defined their complicated relationship. "I'm proud of who you became, Becky. Your mother would be proud, too. Now help me finish what she started." The reset procedure began at 11:47 p.m. With Dr. Sarah Chen's hands moving across controls she'd only theoretical understanding of, guided by Dr. Kessler's decades-old programming notes and her own desperate improvisation. Frank lay motionless on the medical table, his body connected to machines that would monitor every neural pathway as the synthetic systems that had controlled his life for 50 years were systematically dismantled. Rebecca watched the monitors, each screen showing different aspects of her father's transformation. Brain activity patterns shifted in real time. Electrical impulses rerouted themselves around areas where synthetic materials were being neutralized, and vital signs fluctuated wildly as Frank's nervous system adapted to its first taste of true autonomy in half a century. Neural interface coherence dropping to 60%, Dr. Chen announced, her voice professionally calm despite the sweat beading on her forehead. Synthetic material integration beginning to reverse. Outside Tom, Bradley coordinated the facility's defenses as federal tactical teams surrounded the converted missile silo. The protective network had prepared for this confrontation for years, but they were vastly outnumbered by forces equipped with technology specifically designed to capture Lazarus subjects alive. Rebecca, they're broadcasting activation signals, Tom reported through the facility's communication system. They're trying to remotely access Frank's systems before we can complete the reset. The monitors around Frank's bed suddenly erupted in chaotic patterns as competing signals fought for control of his synthetic neural interfaces. Frank's body convulsed as his brain became a battlefield between the reset procedure and the government's reactivation attempts. "I'm losing him," Dr. Chen said, her hands flying across emergency controls. "The competing signals are overloading his neural pathways. I need to speed up the reset process, but that increases the risk of permanent brain damage." Rebecca leaned over her father, speaking directly into his ear despite the medical chaos surrounding them. "Dad, remember who you are without them. Remember Helen. Remember our family. Remember the man you were before Vietnam." Frank's eyes opened, focusing on Rebecca with tremendous effort. "I can hear them," he whispered. "Other voices, other minds. The network is trying to pull me back in." Through Frank's connection to the Lazarus network, Rebecca realized he was experiencing the activation attempts being made on dozens of other survivors simultaneously. His consciousness was being stretched across multiple neural systems, each one fighting for survival as government teams tried to reassert control. 43 subjects showing activation responses nationwide, Tom reported. Heart attacks in Phoenix and Detroit. Seizures in Portland and Miami. They're killing the other survivors to prevent the network from falling outside their control. Dr. Chen made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. "I'm accelerating the reset. Frank, if you can hear me, this is going to hurt. But it's the only way to break their hold on you and stop what's happening to the others." She engaged the final sequence of Kessler's codes, sending a massive electromagnetic pulse directly into Frank's synthetic neural interfaces. Every monitor in the medical bay flashed red as Frank's body arched off the table, his mind experiencing the equivalent of major surgery while fully conscious. But something unexpected happened. Instead of simply neutralizing Frank's systems, the reset codes began broadcasting through the existing network connections to every other Lazarus subject. The pulse that was freeing Frank from government control was simultaneously being transmitted to survivors across the country. Neural activity spiking in all monitored subjects, Tom announced, reading reports streaming in from observation posts nationwide. But it's not activation, it's liberation. The synthetic systems are shutting down everywhere simultaneously. Rebecca watched her father's face as the final connections to his artificial neural components were severed. The tension that had marked his features for as long as she could remember began to fade, replaced by an expression of peace she'd never seen before. Integration dropping to 10%, Dr. Chen announced. Synthetic material becoming inert. Neural pathways stabilizing around organic structures. Frank's eyes opened again, but this time they held a clarity that was entirely his own. "The voices are gone," he said simply. "For the first time in 50 years, my thoughts are completely my own." But their triumph was interrupted by explosions from the facility's upper levels as federal teams breached the outer defenses. Tom Bradley's voice came through the speakers with urgent intensity. "They're through the main doors. We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach the medical bay." The reset worked, but now we need to get Frank out of here before they can capture him for examination. Rebecca realized that saving her father was only the first part of their challenge. Now they had to escape with the evidence that could expose Project Lazarus, while avoiding capture by forces that had spent decades perfecting the art of making inconvenient witnesses. Disappeared. Dr. Chen quickly disconnected Frank from the monitoring equipment, her medical training taking over as she prepared him for transport despite his weakened condition. He's stable, but the neural reset has left him exhausted. Moving him now is risky, but staying here is certain death or worse. Frank struggled to sit up, his movements unsteady but determined. "I can walk. After 50 years of having my thoughts monitored and controlled, a little physical weakness isn't going to stop me from finally being free." Tom Bradley appeared in the medical bay, his tactical gear indicating he'd been in direct combat with the federal assault teams. "We've got a window, but it's closing fast. There's an emergency exit through the old missile launch tunnel, but it comes out 3 miles from here in open farmland. We'll be exposed, and they have helicopters with thermal imaging." Rebecca gathered the encrypted drives containing all their evidence, ensuring multiple copies were secured in different locations on her body. Whatever happened next, the truth about Project Lazarus would survive. "There's one more thing we need to do," Frank said, his voice growing stronger as he adapted to his newly liberated consciousness. "The other survivors who are still alive, they need to know what happened to them, why they've been sick, and that they're finally free." Rebecca realized her father was right. Dozens of elderly veterans across the country had just experienced the sudden shutdown of neural systems they'd never known they possessed. They would be confused, possibly frightened, and certainly in need of medical attention and explanations. "We'll get the story out," Rebecca promised. "But first, we need to survive the next few hours." As they prepared to make their escape through the abandoned missile silo, Rebecca understood that their fight was far from over. They had freed Frank and the other Lazarus survivors, but the people responsible for 50 years of systematic abuse and murder were still in positions of power, still capable of creating new atrocities to cover up their old ones. The sound of boots echoing through the facility's corridors grew closer, and Rebecca gripped her father's hand as they prepared to run toward an uncertain freedom that felt more valuable than anything she'd ever fought to achieve. The escape through the abandoned missile launch tunnel became a race against time and technology as federal teams deployed electromagnetic pulse devices designed to disable the facility systems and trap anyone inside. Rebecca supported her father as they moved through the dark passage, his strength returning gradually as his brain adapted to functioning without synthetic assistance. Dr. Sarah Chen led the way with night vision equipment, her medical bag slung over her shoulder containing samples and documentation that would provide crucial evidence for the investigation Rebecca was already planning. Behind them, Tom Bradley and 2 other protective network members set explosive charges designed to collapse the tunnel and prevent pursuit. "The exit is just ahead," Dr. Chen whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and apprehension. "But Tom's intelligence reports indicate helicopter coverage of the entire area. They're not planning to let us walk away from this." Frank paused in the tunnel, his hand pressed against the concrete wall as he gathered strength. For the first time since the reset procedure, he seemed fully present in the moment, his awareness sharp and unfiltered by artificial influence. "They're not going to give up," he said quietly. "Even with the network shut down, we represent evidence of crimes that could bring down entire government departments. They'll hunt us until we're dead or silenced permanently." Rebecca felt the weight of her father's words, but also the determination that had driven her investigative career. Then we make sure the truth gets out before they can stop us. I've already transmitted preliminary files to 6 different news organizations. If we don't make contact within 12 hours, the story goes public automatically. They emerged from the tunnel into an Iowa cornfield under a moonless sky, the darkness providing cover but also concealing potential threats. Thermal imaging helicopters circled in the distance, their search patterns indicating they hadn't yet located the tunnel exit. Tom Bradley's secure phone buzzed with updates from other protective network positions. "Good news and bad news," he reported. "Good news. Lazarus survivors nationwide are reporting sudden relief from symptoms they've had for years. Heart palpitations, headaches, strange dreams, all stopping simultaneously when Frank's reset went through. Bad news. Federal response teams are moving to secure every surviving subject before they can talk to media or family." Dr. Chen checked Frank's pulse and pupil response as they moved through the cornfield. "Your father's vital signs are stabilizing, but the neural reset has left him vulnerable to shock and exhaustion. We need to find shelter and medical support soon." Their destination was a safe house Tom had established 30 miles away, but reaching it would require crossing areas where they would be completely exposed to aerial surveillance. Rebecca realized they needed a diversion, something that would draw federal attention away from their escape route. "I have an idea," she said, pulling out her satellite phone. "But it's going to make us even bigger targets." Rebecca connected to a live news feed through her contacts at CNN, broadcasting directly from the cornfield while federal helicopters searched for them in the background. "This is Rebecca Dorman reporting live from rural Iowa, where my father, Vietnam veteran Frank Dorman, has just been freed from 50 years of government-imposed neural control as part of a classified program called Project Lazarus." The broadcast went live instantly, reaching millions of viewers as Rebecca provided a condensed version of everything they discovered. She showed Dr. Kessler's documents, played recordings of his confession, and described the systematic murder of veterans who had served their country with honor. The same government that sent these men to fight for freedom spent decades treating them as laboratory rats. And now they're trying to cover up their crimes by eliminating the evidence, including the survivors themselves. Frank stepped into camera range, his appearance shocking viewers who could see the physical toll of his ordeal, but also the newfound clarity in his eyes. "My name is Frank Dorman, and I'm one of the last survivors of Project Lazarus. For 50 years, I carried technology in my brain that monitored my thoughts, influenced my behavior, and was designed to kill me when I became inconvenient. Tonight, that technology was removed, and for the first time since Vietnam, my mind is completely my own." The broadcast lasted only 8 minutes before federal jamming equipment cut the signal, but 8 minutes was long enough. Social media exploded with shares and commentary. Other news organizations scrambled to verify and expand the story, and government officials found themselves facing questions they'd hoped never to answer. More importantly, the broadcast had achieved its intended tactical purpose. Federal forces converging on their position were now dealing with a public relations crisis that required immediate damage control. Resources that had been focused on capturing Frank and his rescuers were suddenly diverted to managing the media storm. Rebecca had unleashed Dot as they reached Tom Bradley's vehicle, hidden at the edge of the cornfield. Rebecca realized they had succeeded in ways that went far beyond simply saving her father's life. They had shattered a 50-year conspiracy of silence and given voice to veterans who had been systematically betrayed by the institutions they had served. But survival was still not guaranteed. The drive to safety would take them through territory controlled by people who had already proven they would kill to protect their secrets. And Rebecca knew the most dangerous part of their journey was still ahead. 6 months after that night in the Iowa cornfield, Frank Dorman sat on his front porch in Millfield, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The same wooden chair, the same ceramic coffee mug, the same small-town quiet, but everything had changed. For the first time in 50 years, the thoughts in his head were entirely his own, and the silence in his mind felt like freedom. The congressional hearings had lasted 3 months, with Frank serving as the primary witness in what news organizations called the largest government accountability investigation since Watergate. Dr. Edmund Kessler had testified from his retirement home, his confession providing crucial details about Project Lazarus's scope and methodology. Rebecca's evidence, Patricia Hendricks' medical files, her recordings of Kessler's admissions, Dr. Sarah Chen's scientific analysis had proved irrefutable. The final count was sobering. 347 veterans had been subjected to Project Lazarus procedures between 1970 and 1973. Of those, only 31 were still alive when Frank's neural reset transmitted freedom to the entire network. The rest had died according to schedule, their deaths carefully disguised as natural causes to hide one of the most extensive human experimentation programs in American history. Rebecca's Pulitzer Prize nomination had been confirmed the previous month. Her investigation recognized as a masterpiece of journalism that had exposed institutional corruption at the highest levels. But the award mattered less to her than the sight of her father sitting peacefully on his porch, his eyes clear and present in ways they hadn't been since she was a child. "The memorial garden looks beautiful," Rebecca said, joining Frank with her own cup of coffee, a ritual they'd established during her extended stay in Millfield, as she'd helped him navigate the aftermath of his liberation. The garden occupied the space where Helen's roses had once grown wild and untended. Now it held a carefully designed memorial to the Project Lazarus victims, with a granite wall listing the names of every veteran who had been subjected to the experimental procedures. Frank had insisted that Helen's name be included, recognizing her as both a victim and a hero who had sacrificed her own freedom to protect the subjects under her care. Dr. Sarah Chen's testimony had been crucial in establishing the medical basis for what had been done to the veterans. Her analysis of Frank's synthetic neural interfaces had provided Congress with unprecedented documentation of how human beings could be turned into biological machines without their knowledge or consent. Sarah had returned to trauma surgery afterward, her confidence restored by the knowledge that she had played a crucial role in exposing and ending systematic institutional abuse. The hardest part, Frank reflected, isn't dealing with what they did to me. It's understanding how many people knew and chose to stay silent for 50 years. The investigation had revealed layers of complicity that extended far beyond the original Project Lazarus team. Military officers, government officials, medical professionals, and intelligence agents had all participated in or covered up the program. Their silence purchased with career advancement, research funding, or simple bureaucratic convenience. But there had also been heroes. Tom Bradley and his protective network, who had risked their lives to shield Lazarus survivors from termination protocols. Dr. Chen, who had defied federal pressure to help Frank. Even Dr. Kessler, whose guilt-driven confession had provided the keys to liberation. Rebecca had made sure their stories were told alongside the accounts of victimization and betrayal. The legal settlements had been substantial lifetime medical care for survivors, compensation for families of the deceased, and funding for ongoing research into the long-term effects of synthetic neural integration. But money couldn't restore the decades of stolen autonomy or bring back the men who had died to protect institutional secrets. Frank's daily routine now included visits from other Lazarus survivors who traveled to Millfield to meet the man whose neural reset had freed them all. Tommy Chen had become a regular visitor, his own health dramatically improved since the elimination of his synthetic systems. They would sit on Frank's porch for hours, sharing memories of Vietnam and marveling at the sensation of having their thoughts entirely to themselves. "I keep expecting to hear the voices," Tommy had admitted during his most recent visit. "For 50 years, there was always something else in my head, not quite audible, but there. The silence takes getting used to." Rebecca had established a support network for Lazarus survivors, connecting them with medical professionals trained to understand their unique situation and journalists committed to ensuring their stories were preserved. The work had become her full-time focus, a natural extension of the investigation that had started with concern for her father and expanded into a crusade for institutional accountability. The Millfield V, a clinic, had been transformed into a center for experimental treatment victims, staffed by medical professionals who understood the challenges faced by people recovering from involuntary human experimentation. Betty Morrison had been promoted to director, her decades of experience with veterans making her uniquely qualified to oversee care for those whose service to their country had been repaid with systematic abuse. As afternoon faded into evening, Frank and Rebecca sat together on the porch where he had once stared into distances only he could see. The silence between them now held comfort rather than tension, the easy quiet of people who had found their way back to each other after years of wandering separate paths. "Your mother would have been proud of what you accomplished," Frank said, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine peace. "She always said you had the courage to fight battles that needed fighting, even when the odds seemed impossible." Rebecca smiled, understanding that her father's memories of Helen were now clear and unfiltered, free from the synthetic influence that had clouded his emotions for decades. "She would have been proud of you too, Dad. It took incredible strength to choose freedom over safety, especially when you knew it might cost you your life." As the sun set over Millfield, Frank Dorman experienced something he hadn't felt in 50 years. Complete certainty that his thoughts, his memories, and his love for his daughter belonged entirely to him. The price of that freedom had been terrible, measured in decades of stolen autonomy and the lives of men who deserved better from the country they had served. But freedom, once tasted, was worth any price. And in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a small Iowa town, Frank Dorman was finally, truly home.